Hi, everybody. My name's Fabian Alfie, and I'm here with an old friend, Christopher Kleinhenz. Um, I'm a professor of Italian at the University of Arizona. I've been here since 1997. In 1995, I completed my graduate work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison with the person I'm here with.
And I'm Chris Kleinhenz. I taught at Wisconsin for almost 40 years, medieval literature, Dante in particular, and I'm pleased to be able to do this with Fabian, one of my star students.
Well, thank you. Where we are in the poem, we're at the early stages, the very beginning, honestly, of Purgatorio. In Canto 1, Dante and Virgil have come out of hell. They've come out of the cave. They met Cato. Canto 2, they were at the beach and they saw the souls arriving in the ship that is piloted from Rome by the angel. And then in Canto 3, they start heading towards the mountain. It's really in Canto 4 that they actually start climbing the mountain to eventually make their way to the gate of Purgatory itself. I believe it's Canto 9. Am I not correct about that?
Right.
Okay. And so this whole up to about Canto 8 is what's called Antipurgatory or pre-purgatory. And there are a number of groups of individuals who are essentially forced to wait. Do you want to talk about the different types of people here?
In Canto 3, we find the excommunicated souls. In Canto 4, the canto that we're doing today, we have essentially the lazy ones, the ones who just couldn't get around to doing their proper penance, etc., in their life. In Cantos 5 and the first part of Canto 6, we find those who suffered a sudden death and didn't have the normal access to the last rites and so on. And finally, in Canto 6, 7, and 8, we find the negligent princes, the ones who were so involved in temporal affairs that they couldn't think about saving their soul. Yet they're all here in Antipurgatory, waiting for certain periods of time before they then can go to the actual gate of Purgatory proper to begin their penance on the mountain.
Right.
There are ways in which we make comparisons with the Inferno.
Okay.
One of them is the way in which Dante reveals to the souls, both in hell and in purgatory, that he's alive and he's actually making the journey. In hell, Dante's feet move rocks. His bodily weight makes the ship of Phlegyas go more deeply through the waters of the Styx. Mm-hmm. Here in Purgatory, Fabian, he casts a shadow, he breathes.
He breathes, right.
Things that are then, not material. These are more ethereal things that then mark him as a pilgrim. However, in Canto 4, we don't believe that the souls of the lazy even recognize him as a living person. And
no, that's right.
Is the extraordinary nature of his journey.
Right. In Canto 3, they had talked about how he was a living soul. He was going to go back. One of the differences about Purgatorio or Purgatory is that the prayers for the dead can help. You're not here permanently. This is a non-eternal portion of the afterlife, and you can be sped along with prayers, as we saw with Manfred at the end of Canto 3, where he asks Dante to take a message back to his daughter to pray for him. And yet here, when he ends up meeting Belacqua doesn't say anything except that, well, he doesn't know anybody who could pray for him that would, whose prayers would be heard.
That's right. You have to have you have to be in a state of grace to be able for your prayers to make any sense, to have any weight. And knowing Belacqua the way we have learned to know Belacqua and the way Dante knew Belacqua is that he doesn't have any friends like that at all.
Right.
The whole question about the importance of prayer then is significant for this particular part of Purgatory. Mm-hmm. And this whole Canto 4, and we know that we also need to read the poem vertically, by which I mean that we have to look back to Canto 4 of the Inferno to get some sort of perspective on Canto 4 here, because Canto 4 in the Inferno was limbo. And there we had the noble castle, we had the poets, we had the philosophers, we had the ancient warriors, and so on. And we'll talk a bit more about this later. But it is important to remember that Purgatory is a temporal place. It will essentially be unpopulated at the end of time, whereas hell and paradise will continue as they are for all eternity. And so time, measured by the sun, of course, which is crucial in this canto, will then be of utmost importance to Dante and to his journey. Dante spends 3 nights on the mountain of Purgatory and then ascends through the spheres of paradise at noon on Wednesday. In any event, I think that we probably should move on to the overview of this canto.
Sure.
And we have some images that we'd like to show briefly for that.
Okay, let me call up our PowerPoint here. Let's see, here we go. So you should be seeing my PowerPoint.
Very good, okay.
There we go, yes.
So this first image essentially shows this point of transition between Canto 3 and Canto 4. You see Manfred on the left, and then Dante and Virgil starting their climb. It was actually the question that Dante asked, or that Virgil asked the group, how do we get up the mountain? Where do we enter? And finally, they get to that particular point. Next slide.
Okay. And it's important to notice that Virgil hasn't been here. Unlike in Inferno, where Virgil had made the journey before, he hasn't been in Purgatory before, so they have to ask directions. And I think that's important where we're going in our canto.
That's very important, Fabian. You're right. And the whole notion of the difficulty of the ascent. We have San Leo, Noli, Bismantova, and Cacume, which are referred to early on in the canto. And in these, Dante is saying that these are places where one can essentially climb. One has to fly to get there. But none of these places, next image,
sure.
None of these places none of these places holds a candle to the steepness and the difficulty of the ascent up the mountain of Purgatory. But what we get with these 4 place names are the 4 points on the compass, where Noli would represent the western area, Cacume the south, San Leo the east, and Bismantova the north, which means that all of the earth, as it were, there's nothing on earth that is so steep as this.
Right, right. Next slide?
Next slide.
Okay.
When we get through the canto, as we move through the canto, a large part deals with the explanation of why it is that Dante sees the sun on his left-hand side as they face east. And this also brings in the whole question of the geography of Purgatory, where it is on the surface. And we know in terms of Dante's description that the mountain of Purgatory is at the antipodes from Jerusalem. The mountain of Purgatory has the Garden of Eden at the top. It was in Jerusalem, of course, that Christ was crucified. So we have sin and redemption then. Sin at the top of the mountain of Purgatory, redemption in Jerusalem. But it is this question that is discussed in very, I would say, at least for modern readers, arcane terms in terms of the direction. And so we aren't going to pause too much on this. The last part of the canto, the last
there we go.
40 lines or so, deals with Dante's meeting with Belacqua and the lazy souls. And we can see that they're hiding essentially under this rock, which makes me think, I think Fabian think too, that they're hiding from Cato, who was really concerned that people be doing something to gain access to Purgatory. So let's close down the images for now, Fabian, and get back to the whole question.
There we are.
The beginning of the canto. Did you want to talk about the
Sure.
soul and so on?
About the soul, yeah. So it starts off the first about 12 lines. You know, Dante talks about distraction, and I think that's one of the key things, because we're moving. You know, one of the things that I really appreciate about the Divine Comedy and Dante as a poet is the way he weaves motifs through, so that things are repeating to emphasize his meaning. Well, he starts off with a philosophical discussion about distraction. He had been talking to Manfred and hadn't noticed the sun moving through the sky. And so he uses that as proof, a philosophical proof, really, that we have a unified soul. There was a philosophical discussion as to whether we have multiple souls or not. And he says, well, no, because we get distracted. And he hadn't noticed the passage of the sun moving a full 50 degrees, which is, how much time is about 50 degrees?
About 3 hours, I think.
3 hours, that's a long conversation.
A long conversation. And so in terms of the actual time, it's about, scholars have indicated it should be about 9:20 in the morning.
Oh, wow, okay.
We had 2.5, 3 hours for the 50 degrees. And so it's about 9:20, 9:30 in the morning. And as we find at the end of the canto, that another 3 hours have passed, because
Okay.
It's noon essentially at the end of the canto. And so the emphasis on time here is so important, because each soul in the Antipurgatory has to remain for a certain period of time. For the excommunicated, it's the time, how long they had been in a period of excommunication. For the lazy, it's their lifetime. So if a person were 50 years old, that person would have to spend 50 years on the mountain before they could be admitted to purgatory proper.
Hopefully not hiding under a rock like Belacqua.
Right. And then for the ones who died, no, excuse me, I think for the excommunicated, it's 30 times the number of years they were in a state of excommunication.
Excommunication, yeah.
30 times. And so on. So time is important. And for me, this entire canto works, as it were, on the notion of delay and postponement, which is, of course, the essence of the indolent, the lazy.
That's right, yeah.
They couldn't get enough of that sitting down and so on.
They put it all off, and now they're still putting it off.
They're still putting it off. That's
Yeah.
right.
I mean, what's funny is that, you know, we've just had that interaction with Cato at the end of Canto 2, where Cato shows up as they're all distracted, listening to Casella sing Dante's song. And he says, you know, run to the mountain, correte al monte. And so everybody scatters off like birds, as, you know, again, at the end of Canto 2, just a little over a canto before this. And so the idea is, well, you need to be doing something. And yet we get here and we have not just Belacqua, but he's part of a group just sitting under a rock, you know, because, well, you know, they're back to their old ways.
Right. What else to do?
Right.
It's also a canto in which humor seems to come to the fore. It doesn't come to the fore until we actually get to Belacqua, but there are some hints that we get along the way. On the one hand, when Virgil asks the souls in Canto 3, how do we find the place where we can start going up the mountain? And then we have this long hiatus between that moment and the time here in Canto 4, in line 17, where they say, you know, here's what you asked, you know, qui è vostro domando. And like, well, gee, but this took place, what, 3 hours before, and here they are just finding where they are. It's also the question of Dante, or actually Virgil, who asks, maybe there's someone who can be a good guide for us. The saggia scorta that we find being mentioned earlier on in the canto. And of course, there's humor in that too, because who is the person who will then present himself as the scorta saggia? Bellacqua.
Belacqua, who's neither a saggia nor a scorta. I mean, he's
Right.
not going anywhere.
That's right. That's right. Uh, but that whole, I think that we probably would spend our time talking about this canto in the most productive way by looking at that exchange between
Sure.
Dante and Bellacqua, because it is so funny, and the humor is in some cases ironic or sarcastic, but there is a lightness to the humor which you don't find in hell.
Right. So, I mean, they have been struggling to climb, or Dante has been struggling to climb up the mountain. And, you know, Virgil points out a balzo, a ledge where they can sit. And so they're sitting there, and Dante asks the question, he says, I would gladly know how far we have to go, for the mountain rises farther than my eyes can. And then Virgil gives him kind of a non-answer, which again is that humor. And also you wonder, well, how did he get this information? You get the impression like he's just humoring Dante, and he says, oh, the mountain is such that it's always more difficult at the bottom at the beginning. The farther up you go, the less it gives you pain, so it gets easier the higher you get up. Well, again, how does he know that? Is this like the parents with the kids in the back of the car saying, we're almost there. Look, I can see it from here. So again, it's kind of a humorous thing when you think about it, like, well, he shouldn't, he didn't know anything just, again, at the beginning of the canto. Now seems to be wise to the nature of the mountain. And it's at this point that Bellacqua chimes in.
That's right. Yeah. He says in verse 98, he says, perhaps you will be obliged to sit before then. Yeah. You got a long way to go, kid.
Yeah. So
it's
3 days.
Yeah. Virgil is very conscious of the fact that he doesn't really know very much about what's going on. In fact, in Canto 3, he gets he's moved almost to tears, because his reason only goes so far. As he asked Beatrice when you see her at the top of the mountain, how all this works.
Right.
And so we have a different dynamic that's working between Virgil and Dante. Virgil was the maestro, the master, the teacher in the Inferno. Dante was the discepolo. He was the student. Now, there was a cartoon a long time ago talking about Dante and Virgil, the buddy movie. And it's true that it is a type of buddy relationship here, because neither one of them has been here, and they need to ask for directions. They need to find out what's going on. Right. And Virgil's reason will only take him so far. But it's also that relationship that is so poignant and will become more and more poignant the further up the mountain we get. And when Dante bids farewell to Virgil, when Virgil appears, it's one of those really, from the dramatic point of view, a moment in the comedy. One I know I've heard other professors more senior than I, who have taught Dante for years and who have wept at the moment in which Virgil disappears, and their students have wept as well, because we are accustomed to having him, and suddenly he's gone.
He's gone. Yeah, and it's funny because every time I teach this, my students are like, "So wait, he just goes back to limbo?" And it's like, "Yeah." And they're like, and my joke is always, "Yeah, if you want him to go somewhere else, that's fine, but Dante didn't write that part." It's like, you want to rewrite it, but.
Yeah, in terms of the economy of the poem and the that is engendered poem, he can't be saved.
Right, exactly. There is no, as you mentioned earlier, that hell, limbo is a part of hell, and that's permanent.
That's right.
And so that's it. What's funny also is the description of the indolent as they, moving a little bit ahead from where we were, Dante then, or the poet says, we drew near and there were persons in the shade behind the rock in postures people take for negligence. And one of them, who seemed weary, was sitting embracing his knees, holding his face down low between them. And he says, you know, look to Virgil, look at that fellow. He appears more negligent than if laziness were his sister. So, I mean, just
great. Yeah, and the language that Dante uses here is a very colloquial type of language. I mean, he uses the word adokia in verse 109, to look at, and we can say more about that. But he says, se pigrizia fosse sua serocchia in verse 111, if laziness were his sister. So it's not simply a sorella, it's the serocchia.
Right, a very homey way of saying it.
Yeah, and also the way in which he's here, quirito, later on. So there is a very colloquial, almost, I won't say slangy, but we have to remember that these individuals knew each other in Florence.
Right. Yeah. I mean,
there's a wonderful story about that, Fabian. Why don't you tell that story?
Okay, so it comes out of the commentary, the Anonimo Fiorentino, from about 1400, and it says that Bellacqua was a lute maker, and he had a shop. He lived nearby Dante, and so he had a shop, and Dante would see him. He would go into his shop. That is, Bellacqua would go to his shop, but then would end up just lazing around all day. And he used to justify himself by quoting Aristotle. Aristotle said that, you know, the soul becomes wise by sitting and being quiet. And one time Dante responded to him saying, well, then you must be the wisest man alive. So, I mean, at least there were these anecdotes that still circulated, what, about 80 years after Dante's death, about this Bellacqua figure.
Well, the reception of the comedy and the stories that come out of it, and we find Dante and his relationship with various either sinners in hell or saved in purgatory and paradise. I mean, his relationship with Forese Donati, as you know very well, Fabian, when he meets up with Forese on the Terrace of the Gluttons. Yeah. It's that marvelous reunion of these two individuals who had a rather scurrilous relationship, shall we say.
Yeah, I suspect Dante had a lot of scurrilous relationships that we've just lost track of many. So we only have about a minute left. We've been, you know, talking for close to 20 minutes now. How do you want, is there anything you want to say in closing?
Well, I think that one thing that we should remember, and I think, Fabian, you already mentioned this at the beginning, that Bellacqua, or Dante says essentially, are you waiting for a guide in verse 125, or have your old habits claimed you? And then he goes on, he says, oh brother, what good would climbing do? For the angel of God sitting on the threshold would not let me go into the torments. First, it is necessary for the heavens to turn around me outside here as long as they did in my life, since I delayed my good sighs until the end, unless prayer help me first, which must rise up from a heart that lives in grace. What good is any other, since it is not heard in heaven? And we assume from that Bellacqua probably doesn't know anyone in Florence who lives in a state of grace.
Right.
His prayers will do him no good whatsoever.
Right. Somebody else might have said, oh, go back and ask my sister or my cousin to pray for me. And he, just, I don't know anybody.
Yeah,
go ahead.
In fact, at the beginning of Canto 6, the whole crowd of those whose lives were cut off by sudden death,
right?
They're crowding around Dante, asking him to get in touch with X, to get in touch with Y, to have them pray for them so that they can get into purgatory more rapidly.
Right.
We end the canto with another reference to time. And as I said before, it's all a question of time, delay, postponement, which is, of course, the essence of Bellacqua and his motley crew, we could say.
Yeah, I think I like that, the motley crew. Yeah, of course.
The motley crew. Well, I think we've done probably almost as much as we could. I would like to see that last image.
Sure. I'll do the share screen again. So here we go.
And I do this and I say this because Dante is very conscious of the artistic tradition. And the position that Belacqua assumes that we see in the slide on the left on the bottom, we see him holding his knees, his head is down close to his knees. This is, of course, an image of contemplation. And it links back to Canto 4 of the Inferno with Limbo and the philosophical souls there who probably are also in contemplation. But for me, from an artistic point of view, it also reminds me of Giotto. And the image on the right, which is the dream of Joachim in the Arena Chapel, shows Joachim in the same sort of pose as Belacqua. And it's also true that by referring to the big stone behind which, under which, in the shade of which Belacqua and his fellow indolent souls are hiding, shall we say, that rocks are part of the Giotto-esque tradition, as we can see there in that same image on the right with the rocks. The rocks in Giotto seem to have almost the role of one of the protagonists in the image itself. So I would close with that, just saying that we need to be cognizant of the influence of so many different of the arts on Dante, art being one of the major ones.
Yeah. So
thank you, Fabian.
Thank you. This has been a lot of fun.
Anyway, and I hope everyone enjoys the presentation.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Ciao.